I just want to say a quick hello, and then I'm going to turn it over to Hallie. My name is Richard Hyman, and I'm the president of Future Frogmen. This is a nonprofit that I founded. We're a 501c3 in the US, and our mission is to foster ocean ambassadors and future leaders. So we work hard on that. We've got a great team of volunteers, and we really enjoyed our time last week with participating in World Oceans Week. We hosted 3 sessions last week, and we carried this one over from last Wednesday, its original scheduled date, due to the STEM walkout, which we supported, and that's why we're convening today. So Hallie is going to run the show today. She's going to moderate our guests and the Q&A, and also make a presentation on the work that she's been doing. So Hallie, I'm going to turn it over to you. Well, let me just say Hallie is a graduate student at University of Connecticut in the Avery Point campus in Groton, Connecticut. And she'll be finishing her master's in August, I believe. So congratulations on that. And turn it over to you, Hallie.
Great, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so first I'm just going to give a brief intro to my background in research, and then we're going to turn it over to the panelists. All right, so as Richard said, I'm a master's student at the University of Connecticut studying oceanography, and specifically I researched the vulnerability of Dungeness crabs to climate change using regional ocean model projections. So for those of you who don't know, Dungeness crabs are a West Coast species, and they range from Alaska to Central California, and they have a very complex life cycle. It begins with mating of adult males and females. And the females carry about 2 million eggs under their abdomen between the months of October and December, and these eggs then hatch into larvae between January and March. The first larval stage is called a zoea, and it gets transported offshore, where it then molts into a megalopy, and then the megalopy are able to swim and settle back onto the shelf as juveniles between April and August. And the juveniles hang out for about 2 years before they reach sexual maturity, and the cycle can start again. The females have a natural lifespan of 8 to 10 years, whereas the males reach legal catch size for the fishery at about age 4. And this is usually the most valuable single species fishery for the US West Coast every year. And although its value, it also varies a lot, as you can see in these fluctuations of the Oregon landings here. And it's thought that these large fluctuations may be caused by differences in larval recruitment, which could be driven by environmental conditions. And it's really important to look at climate change impacts for this species in particular, because the West Coast is already experiencing effects of ocean acidification and hypoxia, which is low oxygen events. And this is because the long-term global trends are being amplified during seasonal spring and summer upwelling. Upwelling occurs when winds blow from the north and pull the sea surface water offshore. So then water from the depth comes up to replace it. And this water has a signature of low oxygen and high carbon dioxide, as well as being very nutrient rich. And these nutrients stimulate phytoplankton blooms at the surface, which then die off and decompose at the bottom of the seafloor. And this decomposition consumes oxygen and also drives the pH even lower. Experiments in the literature suggest that early life stages will have the greatest consequence from exposure to low pH, shown here, and the eggs in megalopy will have a medium response, whereas juveniles and adults are thought to be relatively resilient. Part of my work was using a larval transport model to predict exposure to low pH between present and future. So here I have particles starting off in the nearshore environment where the adult females would carry their eggs. And as the simulation runs, larvae are being transported by the water currents. And you can see pH is colored here, with light green being high pH and dark green being low pH in the danger zone where we see impacts occurring. These megalopy are swimming now up and down, as you can see the particles bouncing around. And the conclusion of this study was that vulnerability, which is on an index from 1 to 9, with 9 being the highest, and it increases across all three stressors: low pH, low oxygen, and high temperature under future conditions, with vulnerability to oxygen being the most severe overall, but the largest increase between present and future is seen for low pH. So that's all I wanted to share about my research for now. And I also just want to give a shout out to all my wonderful collaborators and funders. And there's my contact info if you have any questions specifically for me. But now I'd like to introduce each of our panelists for our discussion. Let me just pull up my notes here. So I'm going to start off with Stephen Tomasetti, who's a PhD student at Stony Brook studying effects of climate change on shellfish. So the floor is yours, Stephen.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, everybody can see my screen all right and hear me. Thanks a lot, everybody, for attending. As Hallie said, I'm Stephen, a PhD student at Stony Brook University. And I'm pleased to have this opportunity to discuss my research, which involves the effects of coastal change and climate change on economically important shellfish and their habitats. And so we can think of the coastal zone as the crossroads between Earth's atmospheric, oceanic, and terrestrial systems. And of course, human activity alters all three of these systems, and in turn has an effect on coastal processes. In terms of the atmosphere, it's the combustion of fossil fuels that's had the most profound effect. And if we follow the black line here through the last 800,000 years, we can see two things. One, we are already well above the atmospheric CO2 concentrations of recent history. And two, we're continuing to rise rapidly, as shown in the red here, and can expect to double atmospheric CO2 concentrations under a business as usual emission scenario by the end of the century. So of course, these changes are already impacting the atmosphere, leading to global warming, changes in precipitation, and changes in the deposition of nitrogen in the coast. And a lot of this extra heat and carbon in the atmosphere is being taken up by the open ocean, which in the case of heat leads to sea surface temperature, sea surface warming, and also ocean deoxygenation, as warming water holds less oxygen. In the case of carbon, it leads to ocean acidification and the decrease of ocean pH. And that's shown here in this map. Under the same business as usual scenario, we can expect the ocean to decrease by about 0.4 pH units by the end of the century. But in addition to these atmospheric and oceanic influences in the coast, we have this additional influence that's caused by human activities on land. And it's really increasing the supply of nitrogen to the coast and causing additional disruptions. The most significant change has been through fertilizer use, but also urbanization, agriculture, fossil fuel combustion, overfishing. All of these things certainly have an impact. And this is all happening at a time in which humans are increasingly relying on seafoods for their nutrition, which we can see in this graph here, which shows the increase in seafood consumption that's twice the rate of population growth globally. And around 90% of fish species, and to my knowledge, all of the shellfish species come from the coastal zone. But it's tough to know how these species will respond to climate change and coastal change because the conditions of the coastal zone are always changing. They're very dynamic. For instance, here we see conditions fluctuating from what we would consider to be normal oxygen conditions to very low oxygen conditions, and normal pH conditions to severely low pH, not even acidified, well, acidified, but also acidic pH conditions on a daily basis with tides. And so I'm interested in coastal shellfish, and to protect these species, we need to know how warming, low oxygen, acidification, that all varies in space and time in the coast, and also how shellfish respond to these changes. And so I try to address these gaps by combining monitoring with experimentation. So bay scallops, for instance, is one of the species I work with, and they're known to be particularly sensitive to environmental fluctuations. So I use reflective infrared sensors, or what I call the Shellfish fitbit, to measure changes in the heartbeat rate of bay scallops. And these are in association with changes in temperature and dissolved oxygen levels. So if you look at this graph here, for instance, we have the diamonds, which show heartbeat rates of bay scallops that are measured every 15 minutes in the environment, along with temperature that's in red. And we can see that the changes in heartbeat rate follow the changes in temperature very nicely. And we can use instruments like these heartbeat rate sensors to try and pinpoint specific values or durations that would cause scallop stress. I also work in oyster reef habitat, looking at changes in the coastal chemistry with time. So here, for instance, on the graph on the right, we can see fluctuations in the oyster reef pH and that they're more intense than the surrounding environment, especially over the day, night, and tidal cycles. And I'm still working on this, but it seems like the difference in macroalgae cover, which is seen here on the left, in addition to the metabolic activity of oysters, are driving these trends. And so finally, one more thing that I've been working with are blue crab larvae. Similar to Hallie, been working with some crab crustacean larvae. And in these experiments, I've just bubbled some experimental vessels with different combinations of tanked gases, basically to create conditions for blue crab larvae. These conditions are control conditions in which they experience normal dissolved oxygen and normal pH conditions, low oxygen only conditions where they're only experiencing low oxygen but normal pH, low pH only, and then the combination of low oxygen and low pH, which is the environmentally realistic scenario because they're often experienced together. In short, we found that in this combined treatment, there's a more severe consequences on blue crab larval survival than in the individual stressor extreme treatments. And these data have important policy implications because most of the DO and pH policy in the US was created at a time before we were actually thinking about pH closely. And so if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to read our paper, which was recently published in Science, and it discusses this more in depth. So that's it for me, but before I end, I just wanted to stress, we're moving into uncharted territory, particularly in the coastal environment, which is hard to predict. And these long-term changes could affect the duration and magnitude of extreme events, which can influence our fisheries, our economies, can have socioeconomic access issues. And it's crucial that we both do this science, but also use the results to re-examine our policies so we can either mitigate or at least prepare for the potential changes. So thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. For more information, visit our website at www.futurefrogmen.org.